Okay, so before we look at the interpretations, we have to look at the question. Okay, so the question first before we look at the interpretation. Okay, so the first bit will always be kind of the same. So up to there, how far do you agree with, will always be the same on any of these questions that you get. Then it will choose one of the two interpretations, either one or two. You don't know which, it will change. And then it will, this is a really key bit. How far do you agree with interpretation two about? And then this is the top, the impact of Malcolm X on the civil rights movement. So whenever we look at the interpretations, we're looking at them with that in mind. What do they tell us? What do they say? What is their view on the impact that Malcolm X had on the civil rights movement? Okay, then more instructions. Explain your answer using both interpretations. Really, really important that, even though it focuses on interpretation two in the question, you know, we have to also comment on interpretation one, and your own knowledge. Okay, so it needs to be a combination of the two. And in terms of how that looks on the page, it would be something like this. Okay, so here's some headlines in terms of how it needs to look. So we have side one, side two. So ideally, we're looking for 4 paragraphs plus conclusion here. Okay, so it's a big, hefty answer. Hence, we spend 25 minutes on it. Okay. Now, if you don't get 4 paragraphs, it's not the end of the world. You could write a really, really good answer here with 2 on one side, 1 on the other. That would be okay. But, you know, if we're talking about the perfect answer, it's going to be 2 sides and a conclusion. Okay, conclusion is really important. Introduction, I would say, is more optional, although it might help you to set out your argument to have one. Okay, I'm going to focus on the kind of core paragraphs. I'm just going to do 1 on each side, and then we're going to do a conclusion. Okay, right. So now we know what we're looking for, which is the impact of Malcolm X. Then we can look at the interpretations. Okay, so let's look at this one first then. So the first time I'm reading it through, I'm trying to get an overall sense of the interpretation, the view of this historian. So it says, important civil rights leaders were particularly critical of Malcolm X. Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out, what did he achieve while he, that's Martin Luther King, was out putting his life on the line in places like Birmingham. While Malcolm X criticised leaders like MLK, he never established organisations as effective or long-lasting as the NAACP or the SCLC. His suggestions that blacks were frequently left with no choice other than violence seem negative and unhelpful. Okay, so straight away you get a sense that this historian interprets the impact that Malcolm X had as relatively small. Yeah, doesn't take a rocket science to work that out. So what's really important is we kind of bullet point that. So as we're sort of starting to plan for how this might look for interpretation one, we want to think, okay, what's the sort of 2 main points that historian makes? So I'd say the first one that I'd want to write down is that he had a limited impact in terms of legacy, in terms of anything long lasting. So no real legacy. And then I'm just going to switch back. So it says here, never established organizations or effective or long lasting. Okay, no real legacy in terms of long lasting organizations. Okay, so that's one thing that historian says about the impact or lack of it. And then the other thing I'm thinking, as I'm like, what's the other point that he's making? Well, I assume it's a he, it might be a she. The other point that this historian is making about Malcolm X and his impact. So his suggestions that blacks were frequently left with no choice other than violence seem negative and unhelpful. Okay, so sort of had a damaging effect, perhaps by putting a lot of negativity out there, focusing on violence, so not helping the cause. So as well as no real legacy in terms of long-lasting organisations, my other impact was had a negative impact by promoting violence. Okay, so those are my 2 key points there. So overall, this historian feels that Malcolm X had a negative impact. Now, won't always be the case, but quite often you'll find the other interpretation will take sort of a different view, almost the opposite view. Now, this won't always be the case. Sometimes it will be, why was this, which of these 2 things was more important in this time period? One historian will put the case for one thing, the other historian will put the case for something else. You'll kind of have to judge between them. But in this particular case, it's kind of a historian on either side of the debate. So if we look at interpretation 2 now, Malcolm rightly drew attention to the dreadful conditions in American ghettos, and he brought American blacks more closely in contact with oppressed black people throughout the world. He also made black nationalism appealing to the younger generation of young black Americans. He also inspired a new generation of black leaders such as Stokely Carmichael and began what was known as the Black Power movement. Way more positive, right? So if we think about why that might be, so now we have to look through what specifically is this historian saying that Malcolm X got right. So drawing attention to dreadful conditions is one. Bringing black Americans more closely in contact with oppressed black people throughout the world, sort of making this a international movement. Made black nationalism appealing to the angry generation of young black Americans, so bringing a new generation into the fight and inspiring a new generation of black leaders, okay, and starting a movement. So way more positive, yeah? So if I sort of try and summarize that into a couple of bullet points. So let's go back. We got to also think, like, what do I know? Because this stuff about making it an international movement is fine, but there's not so much knowledge there. So I'm probably going to steer away from that. So I'm going to stick with that one first, making black nationalism appealing to angry young black Americans, because I think I can evidence that. So he made black nationalism appealing. You can see how the state of my hands here from all this hand washing. Not pretty. Sorry about that. He made black nationalism appealing to a generation of angry young black Americans. Okay. And I'm going to say the second thing that I think is quite important is that he inspired a new generation of black leaders, because I think I could definitely write about that. Okay. Right. Okay. So here we go. So I've got basically my plan here now. So what I could do if I was writing this full thing, these are basically my paragraphs. Okay. So I've got, if I go back to that PowerPoint and think about the way it's supposed to be set out, side 1, side 2, and then I think about what I've got here on my visualizer on my page, side 1, side 2. Okay. And I've got a focus for each of the 4 paragraphs now. So one paragraph would be about that lack of legacy in terms of long-lasting organisations. Another would be the negative effect he had, the unhelpful effect by promoting violence. Then I could have one about how he inspired this new generation. I could have another one about how he inspired leaders, okay? And then I'm coming to a conclusion about which of those viewpoints I kind of subscribe to more. So the question is asking me, do I agree with this one too? So the other side of that is obviously, if I don't, then I'm probably going to be agreeing with this one more. Obviously, I can be somewhere sort of in the middle. I mean, overall, I would say I probably would lean towards 2 rather than 1 myself. But that's fine. There's no right or wrong to that. It's whichever one you think you know. And remember, you don't have to have this as a heartfelt, genuine opinion. You've just got to come to a conclusion. So, you know, you can decide to make an argument that you don't 100% believe in. Although it's easier if it kind of fits with your gut, you know, you'll find it easier to probably write about if it does. Okay, so